The Nancy Drew Files, Case 83, Diamond Deceit. I hate sitting around, waiting for the phone to ring, George Fane said, glaring at the telephone on Nancy Drew's bedside table. You hate sitting around, period, Nancy said with a laugh. Maybe when Bess told Hannah she was going to call at 3 o'clock, she meant California time. They're 2 hours behind us. George checked her watch again. If she doesn't call soon, we're going to lose our court time. She picked up her tennis racket and started practicing a restrained forehand in the middle of the room. Nancy glanced at herself in the mirror. Her tennis dress was blindingly white. I wonder what's kept Bess in California, she said, tying her reddish blonde hair back. Her mom and dad came back over a week ago. Bess, Marvin, who was George's cousin and Nancy's good friend, had gone to Carmel, California, to visit friends of her parents. My aunt was pretty vague about why Bess decided to stay, George said, flopping down on Nancy's bed. She shot Nancy a teasing glance. Maybe you'd better investigate, Nan. I don't need a new mystery, Nancy said, shaking her head. At 18, Nancy had a reputation as an excellent detective. In spite of George's grumbling, Nancy knew George missed Bess. It was amazing to Nancy that two people as different as Bess and George could be so inseparable. George had short, dark hair and the long, lean body of an athlete. Bess, on the other hand, was petite, curvy, and blonde. The only sports she participated in were dating and marathon shopping. The phone rang, and George didn't hesitate to grab the receiver. Hello? Bess! You were supposed to call over an hour ago. Nancy and I are going to miss our tennis match. George motioned for Nancy to put her ear close so they could both hear what Bess was saying. Sorry, but I got tied up, Bess said, without any further explanation. George rolled her eyes. With Bess, that probably meant she'd met some cute guy and lost track of the time. So, what gives? Nancy said into the receiver. Why did you extend your vacation? You guys, I really love it out here. Nancy could hear the enthusiasm in Bess's voice, even over the phone. Then there must be lots of good shopping, good food, and great-looking guys, George teased. I'm serious, Bess said. I think you'd like it too. In fact, she hesitated a moment, then said in a rush, I was wondering if maybe you'd come out to see how great Carmel is. There'd be plenty of golf and tennis for you, George. I also found some shops that I know you guys will love, and you can stay with me at the Province Inn. Mr. and Mrs. Menendez, my parents' friends, run it. Nancy had to admit that Carmel sounded great. Still, Nancy had the feeling that Bess was holding something back. Is everything okay there? She asked. It's all great, Bess replied. We'd really have a super time. I'd love you to come. There was a long pause before Bess added, and I have one teeny surprise for you. What's that? George asked suspiciously. You have to come here to find out, Bess said mysteriously. Nancy could hear her say something to someone else, but she couldn't make out the words. Putting her hand over the mouthpiece, Nancy spoke to George. Why don't we go? Dad is tied up with a trial now, and Ned is working hard at school. Ned Nickerson was Nancy's longtime boyfriend and a student at Emerson College. George nodded once, slowly, then more eagerly. Sounds good to me. Nancy removed her hand and spoke into the receiver. Okay, we'll come. We'll call you back tonight and let you know when our flight arrives. I can't wait to see you. I can't wait for you to meet Ted. The phone clicked and the line went dead. Ted, George repeated, grinning at Nancy. So that's what this is all about. I can't believe Bess isn't here to meet us, George said. She dropped her suitcase and golf clubs in the middle of the room she and Nancy were sharing at the Province Inn. Mrs. Menendez said there was some sort of problem at her son's restaurant. Nancy paused, then added, Still, I'm not sure why that would keep Bess from meeting us. The two girls were surprised that Bess hadn't met them at the airport as they'd arranged. She merely left a message that she'd been delayed. We'll have to wait until she shows up and explains, George said with a shrug. If Bess had picked us up, we wouldn't have rented a car. Now we can come and go as we please. While Nancy unpacked, she checked out the room Mrs. Menendez had given her and George. It was cheerful and bright, with white plaster walls, a white brick fireplace outlined with navy and white tiles, and blue and white patterned bedspreads and curtains. If it stays this chilly, we'll need to use the fireplace, George said, zipping up the jacket of her navy and red running suit. Bess warned me the weather in Carmel can be cool. Nancy was glad she'd packed a heavy turquoise sweater to wear with her black jeans. Nancy went to the window and peered out at the central courtyard, which the Menendezes had planted with bright and colorful flowers. The inn was just up the road from the beach, and Nancy opened the window a crack to smell the salty sea air. I'm starved, George announced. Nancy turned around to see her friend opening cabinets and the refrigerator in the small kitchenette on the opposite side of their room. Mrs. Menendez said that her son Ted's restaurant is just up the hill. Why don't we walk up there, get something to eat, and surprise Bess? Nancy suggested. Good idea, George agreed. Besides, I want to find out what's going on with Bess and this Ted guy. The restaurant is on Ocean Avenue, the same street we're on, Nancy said. Ocean goes down to the beach, but the restaurant is the other way, back up this hill. It's called the Café de Carmel. Outside the inn, Nancy and George looked down toward the ocean. Ocean Avenue was lined with little shops and houses, all different from one another. There were stucco houses with red tiled roofs and cute little wooden cottages with picket fences. Bess is right about this place. It's absolutely gorgeous, Nancy said, grinning. Listen to those waves, George said. I wonder if there's any surfing. We'll have plenty of time for the beach once we hook up with Bess, Nancy said. We're going to be here until Tuesday, and it's only Thursday. Nancy and George started up the steep hill to the restaurant. They walked slowly, peering into one shop window after another. One shop had nothing but scarves, hats, and other accessories. Another sold only kites in wild shapes and colors. Mrs. Menendez wasn't kidding when she said up the hill, George commented. It is steep, Nancy agreed. But there's so much to look at, I don't mind. In the middle of the second block, George stopped at the window of a jewelry shop. The words Chung Original Designs were painted in gold letters in a small circle in a corner of the window. Those are just what I've been looking for, George said, pointing at a pair of gold geometric earrings. I thought you were starved, Nancy said. Everything can wait for new jewelry, George answered back, winking. The girls were startled just then by the sound of angry voices from inside the shop. Peering through the glass door, Nancy saw a tall, blond young man shaking his finger at a shorter, stocky, balding man. When the blond man grabbed the older man's shirt, the older man pulled away. What's this all about? Nancy wondered aloud. Before she knew it was happening, the door to the shop burst open. Nancy was caught in the path of the balding man, who shoved her back against a wall. The young man followed close behind, an angry expression marring his good looks. Neither man seemed to notice Nancy at all. The balding man paused at the edge of the curb before turning around to face the younger man. Nancy detected a trace of challenge in his expression as he opened his mouth to speak. Save it, Baxter, the blond man snapped, cutting off the older man's words. The young man took a threatening step toward Baxter, his face red and his fists clenched at his sides. If one word of this gets out, you're as good as dead. Chapter 2. Nancy was taken aback at the venom in the young man's words. Glancing over at George, Nancy saw that her friend appeared to be too shocked to move or say anything. Baxter turned his back on the other man, jerked open the door of a black Jaguar parked at the curb, and climbed into the driver's seat. He stared pointedly at the younger man as he locked the doors. Baxter, you can't just drive off, the young man shouted. He pounded on the hood of the Jaguar with his balled-up fists, his face red with rage. Baxter lowered his car window and spoke for the first time. Keep your filthy hands off my car, he snapped. Then he pulled away from the curb. The younger man stood glaring at the car until it disappeared around a corner. Finally, he went back into the small shop. As he brushed by Nancy again, she noticed dirt and grass stains on his faded blue jeans and white t-shirt. His long blonde hair was bleached almost white from the sun, and his skin was deeply tanned. Nancy watched him go behind a display case and put his arm around a petite woman dressed in a long embroidered tunic and silk slacks. She had a single thick black braid and dark almond-shaped eyes. A third person in the shop, an older woman, was dressed in black slacks and a blue blazer and was talking seriously to the couple. "What was that all about?" George asked, joining Nancy. "Those guys practically knocked you down." "I'm fine," Nancy assured her. "But I wonder—" "Nancy! George! I can't believe you're finally here!" Nancy turned to see Bess running across Ocean Avenue toward her and George. She was wearing a white blouse and a black jeans skirt, covered by a red apron with Café de Caramel printed on it in white. Bess gave both girls a big hug. Nancy noticed that a stocky young man in his early 20s had followed Bess across the street. He had straight, dark hair and was wearing black jeans and a white button-down shirt. Standing on the curb a few feet from the girls, he crossed his arms over his chest. "Come over here." Bess took the young man by the arm and pulled him into their circle. "This is Ted Menendez," she told Nancy and George, grinning from ear to ear. Ted shook hands briefly with both girls. He smiled, showing even white teeth. "I'm glad you were able to come visit," he said. "Bess has told me a lot about you two." Despite his warm words, Nancy noticed that Ted's eyes never made contact with hers. His handshake was too quick, almost mechanical. Maybe he was just nervous, she reasoned. "How do you like your room at the inn?" Bess asked, keeping her arm linked with Ted's. Nancy let George answer. Her own attention was distracted as the older woman came out of the jewelry shop and detoured around Nancy's group. "Earth to Nancy," Bess's voice broke into Nancy's thoughts a moment later. "Oh, sorry, Bess," Nancy said. "I got caught up thinking about something that just happened here." Nancy was almost trampled by two men who ran out of that shop a couple of minutes ago. One of them was shouting threats at the other one, George explained. "You mean Len?" Ted asked worriedly. "A big blonde guy?" Nancy and George nodded. "I hope it's nothing serious. I'm going to see what happened here. Bess, can you cover for me at the restaurant?" He squeezed her hand. Bess shook her head and smiled up at Ted. From the way they looked at each other, Nancy guessed that George was right. Ted probably was the reason Bess had extended her vacation. "Len's a good friend of mine," Ted explained to Nancy and George. "We've gotten to know each other pretty well coaching Little League baseball." With that, he entered the jewelry shop. "I hope everything's okay," George said to Bess, "but right now I just remembered I'm starving. It's a good thing Ted owns a restaurant." "Actually, it belongs to his parents. Ted just runs it for them," Bess explained. "He sure is cute. No wonder you decided to stay a little longer," Nancy said, raising an eyebrow at her friend. "Ted's nice," Bess said, blushing slightly, "but he's not the only reason I decided to stay." "Bess, can we talk about this over some food?" George asked. Bess laughed and linked her arm through George's. "Sure, come on over to the restaurant and I'll feed you." Bess led them across the street and through a doorway with a sign that read Café de Caramel. Nancy paused just inside the door to check out the place. The lower half of each wall was covered in black and white tile. Neon-filled tubes shaped like musical instruments were placed on the upper wall space. Chrome-edged tables and red vinyl chairs filled the room. A jukebox stood against one wall. Even though it was the middle of the afternoon, several tables were filled. Bess pointed to a table near the jukebox. "You two sit down and I'll get you something to eat," she said. "I'm just going to bring you something light. We're having a big picnic dinner on the beach with Ted's parents later," she added, disappearing through a red swinging door at the rear of the cafe. "I guess this isn't the first time Bess has helped Ted out," George said to Nancy as they sat down. She seems to know her way around here." Just then, the restaurant door opened, and Ted entered, followed by the tall blonde guy from the jewelry shop. They came over and joined Nancy and George. "This is Len Olson," Ted said. "He and his fiancée, Marcia Chung, rent the shop across the street. Len's a landscape architect, and Marcia's a jewelry designer." "Bess told me you're a detective, Nancy, and I was wondering if you'd listen to what Len has to say." Bess came out of the kitchen with 2 bowls of steaming soup, which she set in front of Nancy and George. "I'll get you one too, Len," she offered. "That's okay. Why don't you sit down while I tell your friend what happened to Marcia?" Len said. Bess stared first at Ted and then at Len. Then she shook a reproving finger in their faces. "Oh, no, you don't. Nancy's here on vacation, not to solve any mysteries." "I don't mind," Nancy said. "Really." Bess pulled up a chair from a neighboring table and placed it between Nancy and Ted. While she settled in, Len picked up a napkin from the table and started folding it into smaller and smaller squares. Nancy sensed his tension. He seemed ready to explode. "Why don't you tell me who that man was you were yelling at, Len?" she prompted. Crumpling the napkin, Len threw it down. "That was Cy Baxter," he said angrily. "Cy's another jewelry designer who has a shop here in Carmel," Ted explained. "He's pretty well known." "Marcia worked for Cy until about 6 months ago, when we could finally afford to rent our own place," Len added. "Marcia has a studio in the back of the shop where she designs and makes the jewelry she sells. I run my landscaping business out of the same office. All I really need are some filing cabinets and a phone. I keep my equipment on my truck. Anyway, Marcia just finished designing a new setting for some diamonds that belong to Joanna Burton." "Joanna Burton? The movie star?" Bess interrupted, her mouth falling open. "Yep," Len said. "I don't think she's made a movie for years, though. Anyway, Miss Burton lives here in Carmel," he went on. "We thought that designing a necklace for a movie star would help Marcia build her reputation." Len shook his head. "We never dreamed something like this would happen." "Something like what?" Nancy questioned. "Did you notice an older woman in the shop?" Nancy and George both nodded. "She's a police detective. Joanna Burton filed a report claiming that the diamonds in her necklace had been replaced with fakes." "Oh no," George said, swallowing a spoonful of soup. "Did she accuse Marcia?" Len shook his head. "No, she was just asking general questions. But while she was there, Cy Baxter came in. He was the one who accused Marcia. He said that she probably switched the stones and kept the diamonds for herself." "How did he know that the diamonds had been switched?" Nancy wanted to know. "Joanna Burton had given him the necklace to appraise. That was when he discovered that the diamonds in it were really cubic zirconia." Seeing the confused looks on the girls' faces, he explained, "Cubic zirconia is a stone that resembles diamonds. It's often used in jewelry imitations. To the untrained eye, CZ looks like the real thing. I know I can't tell the difference." Len sat silently for a few moments, his face a deep red. He was obviously very upset by what had happened. Nancy decided to give him a chance to get himself under control, so she took a few spoonfuls of her soup. It was a delicious, light vegetable puree. Without warning, Len banged his fist on the tabletop, startling Nancy. "He had no right," Len burst out angrily. "Who does Baxter think he is, walking in and making a statement like that? Marcia would never replace real stones with fakes and then try to keep the diamonds." Nancy felt uneasy. There was something scary about Len's explosive temper. Len fell silent again for a minute before turning to Nancy. "Do you think you could try to find out what really happened to the diamonds?" he asked. "Marcia didn't do it, I swear." Len banged his fist down again, causing the bowls of soup to clatter on the tabletop. "If this gets out, no one will let Marcia touch any jewelry. It could ruin her business." Len must have noticed how uncomfortable Nancy was with his anger, because he slowly leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Look, I'm sorry. I guess I got a little carried away." "Please help us," he said in a softer voice. Nancy wasn't sure she wanted to get involved with this case. She was uneasy with Len's temper. and she was on vacation, but his story had definitely aroused her curiosity. Finally, she turned to Len and said, "I'll need to talk to Marcia." "Great," Len told her. "Can she meet with you this evening after she closes the shop, around 8? Bess said in an excited whisper. "Hey, maybe we should go talk to Joanna Burton, too. Do you know where she lives, Len?" "She lives in one of the big houses along 17-Mile Drive," Ted answered for Len. "It's a coast road lined with golf courses and fancy homes. Lots of movie people live there. They even charge a toll to drive along the road to look. Marcia has her phone number if you want to make an appointment to see her," Len added. Nancy's mind raced ahead. "What about Cy Baxter?" she asked. "How far is it to his store? I'd like to find out a little more about his part in all this." "I'll go along and show you," Bess said. "Bess?" Ted looked at her critically. "You're leaving? Now?" Bess was surprised by Ted's response. "We won't take long. We'll be back," she assured him. "But it's getting close to the time for our picnic," Ted said. "Do you really think you should go?" Nancy didn't understand Ted's reaction. Bess had invited her and George to Carmel. Surely he knew that Bess would be spending time with them. Why was he being so possessive? Len didn't appear to notice the tension that had settled over the group. "Then you'll try to find out what happened?" he asked Nancy. "I'm not making any promises, but it can't hurt to ask a few questions," Nancy replied. "Thanks," Len said. He took Nancy's hand and shook it. "I really appreciate it." He stood up and headed toward the door. "I'm going to tell Marcia right now." Nancy, Bess, and George also got up. "Bye, Ted. See you in a little while," George said. Ted folded his arms and stared at Nancy and George as they walked past him. Nancy shivered. The cold anger in Ted's dark eyes chilled her. Chapter 3. "What's with that guy?" George whispered to Nancy as soon as they got outside. Nancy could tell that George had also picked up on Ted's anger. Nancy shrugged. "Isn't Bess coming?" she asked, noticing that their friend hadn't left with them. George pointed into the restaurant. "It looks as if there's trouble in paradise. I don't think Ted wants Bess to go with us." Ted and Bess were standing right inside the cafe, talking. Bess's face was flushed, and she seemed to be close to tears. Ted was holding both of her arms and was speaking very seriously. Ted glanced up and met Nancy's gaze. His expression immediately changed. After saying something more to Bess, he smiled down at her and kissed her on the cheek. A moment later, Bess had joined Nancy and George on the sidewalk. "What was that all about?" George asked her cousin as soon as the door closed. "He's just worried that I'll get into trouble with you guys," Bess said, not very convincingly. "I never should have told him some of the things that had happened to us on cases with Nancy." Nancy hated to see her friend torn between Ted and them. "You don't have to come with us if you don't want to," Nancy said to Bess. "Just point us in the right direction." "There's no way I'm going to miss this," Bess said firmly. "I want to go. Besides, Ted needs to learn to let go a little. He's been spoiled having me all to himself," she added, giggling. "So what's the story with you two anyway?" George asked. "Is this a major romance?" Nancy could tell that George hoped it wasn't. Bess shrugged. "I don't know, not too major, I guess, but Ted's really nice," Bess added with a grin. She led the way up the hill to the next corner, then turned left. While they walked, Nancy went over all that Len had told them about the diamond necklace. "Have you had a chance to get to know Marcia at all?" Nancy asked Bess. "I only met her briefly, when she and Len ate at the restaurant," Bess answered. "She seems nice." Nancy was anxious to meet the designer and form her own impressions. She couldn't know for sure that Marcia hadn't switched the diamonds until she investigated. When the girls were halfway down the block, Bess stopped in front of a shop a little larger than Chung Original Designs. A small sign over the door identified the store as Baxter's Fine Jewelry. "Here it is," Bess announced, opening the door. A bell chimed when Nancy, Bess, and George stepped into the shop. Nancy immediately spotted the short, balding man who had stormed out of Marcia's store earlier. He was standing behind the jewelry counter, scolding a woman in her 40s who was apparently one of his employees. She was wearing a plain black dress, and her long, dark hair was streaked with gray. "I've asked you over and over to use this when removing a stone from its setting, not this." Baxter held up a small instrument to illustrate his point. "And never leave a customer out here in the showroom alone. Can't I leave you in the shop for even 10 minutes without you screwing up?" The woman made no attempt to defend herself. She simply stared at the floor as Baxter went on and on. Nancy was embarrassed to be there. She stared at a Seaside Security sticker in the corner of the window, trying to pretend she wasn't there. If this was the way Cy Baxter treated his employees, she thought, Marcia must have been happy to branch out on her own. Bess and George seemed to be as embarrassed as Nancy to be witnessing the argument. After standing there uneasily for a moment, Bess pulled Nancy and George over to a display of gold charms for bracelets. "Aren't these darling?" she asked. Cy Baxter broke off abruptly, as if he had just realized the girls were there. "We'll be with you in a moment," he said politely. Turning back to his assistant, he lowered his voice so Nancy couldn't hear what he was saying. "I think Mr. Baxter makes these himself," Bess went on. "This is the lone cypress. That's a tree that grows along the 17-mile drive. And these are sea otters. I want to make sure you see some real ones while you're—" Just then, the showroom erupted in noise as dozens of clocks lining one wall of the store began to chime the hour. "Look at that cuckoo clock," George said, pointing at a carved wooden clock whose painted wooden bird popped out to announce the time. "It's pretty cute." "That one also performs on the quarter hour," Cy Baxter said. He had come out from behind the counter to join them. His assistant was just disappearing into a room at the rear of the store. "Would you like me to take it down so you can look at it close up?" "No, thank you anyway," Nancy said. "Can I show you anything else? A necklace? Rings?" Baxter inquired. He was checking the girls over carefully as he talked. Nancy hesitated, trying to decide what approach would work best with the store owner. My name is Nancy Drew," she said, stalling. Baxter peeked at his watch. Nancy decided right then that he wouldn't give any of his time to anyone but a customer. She'd just have to ask the right questions and hope he liked to talk. "I'm looking for someone to design a bracelet," she went on. "I've talked to several people around Carmel asking for recommendations. Your name came up." Nancy paused before adding, "So did Marcia Chung's." "Marcia used to work for me," Baxter said curtly. "Not that she ever appreciated all the things I taught her." He was obviously bitter about Marcia's departure, Nancy thought. "I understand that she recently designed a necklace for Joanna Burton," she said. Baxter's face darkened for just an instant. Then he cleared his throat and said, "Miss Burton is a customer of mine also." "Oh, really? Why did she ask Marcia to do her necklace?" Nancy expected the store owner to become angry, but instead he leaned conspiratorially toward the girls. "I've done a lot of work for Miss Burton in the past, but now, how should I put this? She doesn't always pay her bills. She asked me to design a new setting for her necklace, but at the time she owed me for some work I'd done months earlier, so I refused. Now I wish I had done the design." "If Miss Burton doesn't always pay, why do you wish you'd design the necklace?" Bess asked curiously. "Way to go, Bess!" Nancy silently applauded her friend. She hoped Bess's comment would get Baxter talking about the fake stones. "It's not general knowledge yet," Baxter began. Then he hesitated. He finally continued, "When Joanna got the necklace back, her diamonds were gone, replaced with CZ. That's cubic zirconia." Cy Baxter took a deep breath, clapping his hands together. "Well, enough of that. What kind of bracelet were you considering? Perhaps we'd better talk—" "But what happened to the diamonds?" George pressed, leaning over the counter. "I can't say, but that necklace wasn't anywhere but Marcia Chung's shop," he said, stressing her name. Nancy still had one more question to ask. How did you know the diamonds were replaced? I saw them. Joanna needed to have the new setting appraised for her insurance, and I do appraisals for insurance companies, Baxter explained. When I was examining the necklace, I noticed that the gold prongs holding the stones were scratched. That didn't look like Marcia's usual work. After all, I had trained her. So I took a closer look. How could you tell the stones were fakes? George asked. Cubic zirconia weighs more than diamonds, the jeweler informed the girls. After almost 30 years in the business, I can definitely tell a fake when I see one. Nancy nodded, then changed the subject. About how long does it take to have jewelry appraised? I have some pieces. Cy Baxter smiled and said, Just bring them in any time. I can usually examine the piece and write up a report within 24 hours. So, Nancy would have to leave her jewelry here? Bess inquired. Nancy knew right away what her friend was getting at. Joanna Burton must have left her necklace with Cy Baxter, too. That meant Cy himself would have had the chance to replace the diamonds. Of course, but it would be perfectly safe, Baxter assured her. Now, what kind of bracelet did you want designed, Miss Drew? I really haven't any ideas, Nancy replied. She, Bess, and George patiently waited while Cy Baxter showed them examples of his work. His pieces were very traditional, different from Marcia's more modern ones. Saying she was unable to make up her mind, Nancy politely thanked the jeweler and signed his guest register. Just as they were leaving, the painted bird popped out of the cuckoo clock and performed its solo. It was 6:15. As they started back to the Café de Carmel, Nancy turned to her friends and said, Did you guys hear what Baxter said? It takes him 24 hours to appraise something. Joanna Burton probably had to leave her necklace overnight. He could have stolen the diamonds during that time, Bess added. But why would he switch Joanna Burton's stones and then tell her about it? George wanted to know. Nancy shrugged. Maybe because he knew he could blame it on someone else. Baxter didn't seem to be happy that Marcia left him to open her own jewelry store. Maybe he decided to steal the diamonds and ruin Marcia's reputation at the same time. With a frown, she added, Something else he told us doesn't make sense. Baxter said that there were scratches on the prongs that held the fake stones in place. I don't think an experienced jeweler like Marcia Chung would leave scratches, do you? I've heard only good things about Marcia's work, Bess said. Ted's going to be wondering what happened to us, she added with a nervous laugh as they approached Café de Carmel. It's almost 6:30. That's the time we're supposed to meet his parents on the beach, George said excitedly. I can't wait to see the ocean. Bess pushed open the restaurant door, and a waitress instantly appeared. Hi, Libby, Bess greeted the red-haired girl. Just stopped by to pick up Ted. Ted went on ahead. He was kind of mad, Libby said. He said to tell you he meant 6:30 Pacific time, not Central time. Bess's eyebrows drew together in a worried frown. Then she turned to Nancy and George and laughed. I guess we'd better get down there before they eat everything. She herded Nancy and George out the door, then set a brisk pace for their walk to the beach. Hey, slow down, George said. I've never known you to go so fast. We'll only be about 5 minutes late. That's not such a big deal, Nancy added. Bess seemed to be awfully concerned about disappointing Ted. Nancy was beginning to think that maybe Ted's expectations were a little unreasonable. When they reached the beach, Bess turned left and walked along the road. Oh, this is beautiful, George exclaimed, pausing. Nancy had to agree. A steep, sandy hill descended some 20 feet to the beach below. Several wooden stairways led down to the flat sand. Out on the water, the sun's glow seemed to color the entire Pacific Ocean. Bess said distractedly. Ted said he'd build the fire down the beach this way, by one of the staircases. She scanned, then pointed. There they are. See the fire? Nancy and George followed as Bess hurried to the first staircase and took the steps to the beach. She seems awfully nervous, George commented. What's the big deal? Ted was about 50 feet away with 2 other people. A fire blazed beside them, and a blanket had been spread out on the beach near it. Nancy recognized Mrs. Menendez, of course. The heavy-set woman with short, dark hair had checked Nancy and George into their room. The other man had the same dark hair and stocky build as Ted. He had to be Mr. Menendez, Nancy guessed. "I guess you met Mrs. Menendez at the inn earlier," Bess told Nancy and George. "This is Ted's dad. You can see where Ted gets his good looks," Bess said. Mr. Menendez acted embarrassed, but Nancy could tell he loved Bess's compliment. "It's nice to meet you girls. I hope you like it here in Carmel," he said. Then he sat with his wife. "So far we love it," George assured him. Ted continued to stare out at the water, Nancy noticed. He made no move to greet her or George. Was he still mad that they had taken Bess to Cy Baxter's shop? Nancy stifled the irritation that rose inside her. She wanted to give Bess's new boyfriend a chance, after all. Bess acted as if she were bursting with a secret. Tapping Ted on the shoulder, she whispered something into his ear and got him to turn around. "Hey, cuz," George said, "you convinced Nancy and me to travel all this way because you said you had a surprise for us. We've been here almost half a day, and we still haven't been surprised. What gives?" Bess's blue eyes were sparkling. "Maybe you'd better sit down," she said to George and Nancy, indicating the blanket. "This must be big," Nancy said, plopping down next to George. Bess grabbed Ted's arm, and Nancy exchanged an uneasy look with George. She had a feeling that this was going to be really big. Was Bess thinking of getting married? Bess took a deep breath and let it out. She focused first on George, then on Nancy, and said, "You guys, I'm thinking about moving to Carmel."